I really want to say three things. I want to say something about the nature of the crisis, which you alluded to, Ruth, and you made the comparison with 2008. And one could also make the comparison with 1929 and the 1930s, the Great Depression. And when you do that, when you make comparison with the crisis now and previous capitalist crises, you have to come to the conclusion that this is potentially the worst crisis in the history of the system, and therefore the worst crisis actually in the history of humanity and the planet. And I want to start by giving three reasons why I think it is that serious, what we now face. The first is the climate crisis, which you referred to, Ruth, and that is something that wasn't there as a major problem facing humanity and the planet in the 1930s. We've got about 10 years or so to prevent catastrophic and potentially irreversible ecological breakdown. And of course, the climate crisis is just one aspect of a multifaceted ecological crisis, a whole series of ecological crises, into which we can now put the pandemic as well, because there's a sense in which the pandemic is part of that rupture, that rift, that metabolic rift between humanity and nature, which is brought about by this process of uncontrolled, unregulated capital accumulation on a global scale. That's one reason why this crisis is so serious. Here's the second. You see, last time in the 1930s, we lost. The left went down to defeat, and we had fascism, war, and genocide. The choice was socialism or barbarism, and we got barbarism. And they killed 60 million people. They killed 60 million people in the war and the genocide. If there was that kind of military crisis today, they wouldn't kill 60 million. If there was an unlimited military confrontation, they would kill 6,000 million. They have the potential, they have the arsenals to destroy everybody on the planet. That's why this is potentially so much more serious than it was in the 1930s. And here's the third thing. You see, in the 1930s, there were still huge numbers of people who were, in a sense, outside the system. There was still an enormous peasantry, huge numbers of subsistence farmers who weren't really affected by the global capitalist crisis. Even in the 1970s, that was still true. You still had very large numbers of independent peasants in the 1970s. In the last 40 years of neoliberalism, that has almost completely disappeared, that peasantry, that independent peasantry. The system has now penetrated into the pores of every part of human society globally and penetrated into every part of nature. It is a totally globalized system in a way that is, to an extent that has never been true before. Now, that makes the crisis this time, I think, probably the worst in the history of the system and therefore in the history of humanity. Now, that's my second point, and it's to talk about the working class. The working class is bigger on a global scale than ever before. The International Labour Organization says that the working class is now, well, the number of workers is about 3 billion people, which means when you put in the families, it's virtually everybody. It's about 6 billion people altogether of the 7 billion people on the planet. The working class in terms of numbers, in terms of proportion, is overwhelmingly dominant now in a way that hasn't been true before. Huge proportion of that working class is precarious. The International Labour Organization estimates that about 60% of the global working class is precarious. A very large proportion of it is effectively surplus. In other words, it's not able to make any kind of living in the system, proper living in the system at all. There's a huge mass, there's a core working class globally, there's a huge precarious working class globally, and there's also a huge mass of surplus humanity, what Marx, of course, called the reserve army of labour. But this is now on a global scale and unprecedented in terms of numbers. But here's the problem for us. And now I'm going to sort of make reference to this concept of class in itself and class for itself. You see, class in itself is unprecedented in terms of size. Its dominance as a proportion of humanity. Vast majority of humanity are effectively now part of the international working class. And yet when you talk about class for itself, that is workers organizing themselves, mobilizing and fighting back. In other words, workers becoming a political force, workers becoming part of the process of struggling for change. There we have a crisis. Very small proportion of that vast international working class is now organized in an effective way. You think about the situation in Britain. Let's take, part of the core of the system, or the old developed parts of the system. The situation in Britain is that the trade union movement, it's not just that it's halved in size in terms of trade union members, it's also when you look at the quality of union organization, it's completely hollowed out. There's workplace organization, rank and file organization is minimal. Even in industries where there is a relatively high level of trade union organization compared with the way it was in the 1970s and so on. So we've got that problem of a very high degree of casualization, of insecurity, of atomization of the class not actually being organized as a class. That's my second point. My third point is this, and that of course is part of the depth of the crisis. The agent of social transformation is not organized in the way that we need it to be. My third point is this, and it's to say, talk about the revolutionaries. You see, you look at the scale of the crisis, you look at the weakness of the working class in an organizational sense on a global scale, and you have to say that the responsibilities of revolutionaries have never been greater. And the responsibility of revolutionaries in this situation is to create revolutionary organization. We live with the actuality of the revolution. I'm going to use that expression that Lukács used about Lenin when he was Lukács was created by that great period of working class upsurge between 1917 and 1923. He wrote this short study of Lenin, and he uses the expression Lenin becoming the embodiment of the actuality of the revolution, not just in Russia, but on a global scale, though the term could equally well have been applied to Trotsky. They both lived the actuality of the revolution in that period. And what does it mean? It means that at that moment in time, humanity was facing a choice between socialism and barbarism. The revolution was inherent in the crisis. The revolution was made by the crisis into an imperative for humanity. We live with that as well. We live with the actuality of the revolution in that sense, the necessity for international working class revolution because of the scale of the crisis. And the task becomes what it has been really since Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in the winter of 1847 to 48. It's the same task as Lenin sets himself when he builds the Bolshevik Party. It's the same task as Trotsky set himself in 1938 when, in desperation, he launched a Fourth International, which didn't really exist except in people's imagination. Each of these great revolutionaries in the past are addressing this central question of the organization of the revolutionaries, who need to be embedded in the vanguard forces of the class, building class organization and building class struggle, linking different struggles together and beginning to fan the flare-ups into a conflagration, which is the central job of revolutionaries. We have to do all of that. We have to do all of that in a very, very short time scale, starting from a very, very low base indeed, when the revolutionary socialist tradition is probably weaker than it's been perhaps for 100 years, no, probably beyond, probably more than 100 years. And this is my final point, really, in relation to where we are as revolutionaries today. You see, what Marx did not say in the Communist Manifesto is that the revolutionaries should be organized in 57 different varieties of small group. We used to talk about the 57 varieties of Trotskyist group back in the sort of 1980s. It was self-mockery. because we were all in one group or another, and we called it the 57 varieties. He didn't say the revolutionaries should be in 57 different varieties of small group. Lenin didn't say in Russia in 1908, the revolutionaries should be in 57 different varieties of small group, defining each of those groups in terms of minute differences between one group and another. Trotsky didn't say that in 1938 when they launched the Fourth International. The serious revolutionaries have always said that revolutionary organization is an obligation on the revolutionaries who are serious, not to prioritize building a small group. And I'm going to use a term that is appropriate. By a small group, I mean a sect which prioritizes building its own organization over building unity among revolutionaries embedded in the struggles of the class. That's the difference between serious revolutionaries and a sect. And don't misunderstand me, comrades, I come from that tradition. We've all got histories, we've all been in these small organizations, and the place where I've got to is the realization that fragmenting the very weak revolutionary forces that we have in Britain today and in general across the globe into a series of small groups based on minute differences is madness. The differences should actually be part of a debate inside a single organization. We have an obligation as revolutionaries, as serious revolutionaries, to recognize the seriousness of the crisis facing humanity and the planet, the greatest we have ever faced, to recognize the weakness of the class and the need for the best revolutionaries, the best class militants, the best socialists to come together to help to rebuild class organization and connect the different struggles together. That responsibility, and it's a responsibility to history in the sense that, just as was the case in the time of the First World War, just as was the case in the build-up to the Second World War, it really is the case that, again, we face a choice between socialism and barbarism. We have those who understand, those of us who understand that, have a tremendous responsibility to try and build effective organization.